Hello, and welcome to Reading Little Blue Books Out Loud. These are Little Blue Books. As you can tell by the top title, it says Little Blue Book number 813, and we are currently reading number 813, Contemporary American Philosophers, Santayana, James, and Dewey, written by Will Durant, PhD. This is currently part 2. We are still reading about Santayana, and we left off on page 12. And we will backpedal a little bit to page 11. We are not asked to abolish our conception of the natural world, nor even in our daily life to cease to believe in it. We are to be idealists only north-northwest, or transcendentally, when the wind is southerly, we are to remain realists. I should be ashamed to countenance opinions which, when not arguing, I did not believe. It would seem to me dishonest and cowardly to mutilate under other colors than those under which I live. Therefore, no modern writer is altogether a philosopher in my eyes, except Spinoza. I have frankly taken nature by the hand, accepting as a rule in my farthest speculation the animal faith I live by from day to day. And so, Santayana is through with epistemology, and we breathe more easily as we pass on with him to that magnificent reconstruction of Plato and Aristotle, which he calls the life of reason. This epistemological introduction was apparently a necessary baptism for the new philosophy. It is a transitional concession. Philosophy still makes its bow in epistemological dress, like the labor leaders who for a time wear silk breeches at the king's court. Someday, when the Middle Ages are really over, philosophy will come down from these clouds and deal with the affairs of men. Chapter 3. Reason in Science. The life of reason is a name for all practical thought and action justified by its fruits in consciousness. Reason is no foe of the instincts. It is their successful unison. It is nature become conscious in us, illuminating its own path and goal. It is the happy marriage of two elements, impulse and ideation, which, if wholly divorced, would reduce man to a brute or a maniac. The rational animal is generated by the union of these two monsters. He is constituted by ideas which have ceased to be visionary and actions which have ceased to be vain. Reason is man's imitation of divinity. The life of reason bases itself frankly on science, because science contains all trustworthy knowledge. Santayana knows the precariousness of reason and the fallibility of science. He accepts the modern analysis of scientific method as merely a shorthand description of regularities observed in our experience, rather than laws governing the world and guaranteed unchangeable. But even so modified, science must be our only reliance. Faith in the intellect is the only faith, yet sanctioned by its fruits. So Santayana is resolved to understand life. Feeling like Socrates, that life without discourse is unworthy of a man, he will subject all the phases of human progress, all the pageant of man's interest in history, to the scrutiny of reason. He is modest enough nevertheless. He proposes no new philosophy, but only an application of the old philosophies to our present life. He thinks the first philosophers were the best, and of all of them he ranks highest Democritus and Aristotle. He likes the plain, blunt materialism of the first, and the unruffled sanity of the second. In Aristotle, the conception of human nature is perfectly sound. Everything ideal has a natural basis, and everything natural an ideal development. His ethics, when thoroughly digested and weighed, will seem perfectly final. The Life of Reason finds there is classic explanation, and so, armed with the atoms of Democritus and the golden mean of Aristotle, Santayana faces the problem of contemporary life. In natural philosophy, I am a dedicated materialist, apparently the only one living, but I do not profess to know what matter is in itself. I wait for the men of science to tell me. But whatever matter may be, I call it matter boldly, as I call my acquaintances Smith and Jones, without knowing their secrets. He will not permit himself the luxury of pantheism, which is merely a subterfuge for atheism. We add nothing to nature by calling it God. The word nature is poetical enough. It suggests sufficiently and generative and controlling function the endless vitality and changeful order of the world in which I live. To be forever clinging to the old beliefs in these refined and denatured forms is to be like Don Quixote, tinkering with obsolete armor. Yet Santayana is poet enough to know that a world quite divested of deity is a cold and uncomfortable home. Why has man's conscience in the end invariably rebelled against naturalism and reverted in some form or another to a culture of the unseen? Perhaps because the soul is akin to the eternal and ideal. It is not content with that which is and yearns for a better life. It is saddened by the thought of earth and clings to the hope of some power that may make it permanent amid the surrounding flux. But Santayana concludes bluntly, I believe there is nothing immortal. No doubt the spirit and energy of the world is what is acting in us, as the sea is what rises in every little wave, but it passes through us, and cry out as we may, it will move on. Our privilege is to have perceived it as it moves. Mechanism is probably universal, and though physics cannot account for the minute motion and the pollination in the earth's crust, of which human affairs are a portion, the best method is psychology. It is supposed that mechanism prevails even in the inmost recesses of the soul. Psychology graduates from literature into science only when it seeks the mechanical and material basis of every mental event. Even the splendid work of Spinoza on the passions is merely literary psychology, a dialect of deduction, since it does not seek for each impulse and emotion its physiological and mechanical ground. The behavioralists of today have found the right road, and should follow it unfrightened. So thoroughly mechanical and material is life, that consciousness, which is not a thing but a condition and a process, has no casual efficacy. The efficacy lies in the heat with which impulse and desire move brain and body, not in the light which flashes up as thought. The value of thought is ideal, not casual. That is, it is not the instrument of action, but the theater of pictured experience and the recipient of moral and aesthetic delights. It is the mind that controls the bewildered body and points out the way to physical habits uncertain in their affinities. Or is it not much rather an automatic inward machinery that executes the marvelous work, while the mind catches here and there some glimpse of the operation, now with delight and adhesion, now with impotent rebellion? Lalande, or whoever it was, who searched the heavens with his telescope, and could find no God, would not have found the human mind if he had searched the brain with a microscope. Belief in such a spirit is simply belief in magic. The only facts observed by the psychologist are physical facts. The soul is only a fine, quick organization within the material animal, a prodigious network of nerves and tissues growing in each generation out of a seed. Must we accept this buoyant materialism? It is astounding that so subtle a thinker and so ethereal a poet as Santayana should tie to his neck the millstone of philosophy, which after centuries of effort is as helpless as ever to explain the growth of a flower or the laughter of a child. It may be true that the conception of the world as a bisectable hybrid, half material and half mental, is the clumsy conjunction of an automation with a ghost. But it is logic and lucidity personified alongside of Santayana's conception of himself as an automaton automatically reflecting on its own automatism. And if consciousness has no efficacy, why was it evolved so slowly and so painfully? And why does it survive in a world in which, unless things so soon succumb, consciousness is an organ of judgment as well as a vehicle of delight? Its vital function is the rehearsal of response and the coordination of reaction. It is because of it that we are men. Perhaps the flower and its seed and the child and its laughter contain more of the mystery of the universe than any machine that ever was on land or sea. And perhaps it is wiser to interpret nature in terms of life rather than terms of death. But Santayana has read Bergson, too, and turns away from him in scorn. Bergson talks a great deal about life. He feels that he has penetrated deeply into its nature, and yet death, together with birth, is the natural analysis of what life is. What is this creative purpose that must wait for sun and rain to set it in motion? What is this life that in any individual can be suddenly extinguished by a bullet? What is this clan vital that a little fall in temperature would banish altogether from the universe? Let us leave him the last word here. Chapter 4. Reason in Religion. Stibeve remarked of his countrymen that they would continue to be Catholics long after they had ceased to be Christians. This is the analysis of Renan, the Anatole France, and of Santayana too. He loves Catholicism as one may still long for the woman who has deceived him. I do believe her, though I know she lies. He mourns for his lost faith, that splendid error, which conforms better to the impulses of the soul than life itself. He describes himself at Oxford in the midst of some ancient ritual. Exile that I am, exile not only from the wind-swept moor where Gardarana lifts his purple crest, but from the spirit's realm, celestial shore, goal of all hope and vision of the best. It is because of this secret love, this believing on belief, that Santayana achieves his masterpiece in Reason in Religion, filling his skeptical pages with a tender sadness and finding in the beauty of Catholicism plentiful cause for loving it still. He smiles. It is true, at the traditional orthodoxy, the belief, namely, that the universe exists and is good for the sake of man, or of the human spirit. But he scorns the enlightenment common to young wits and worm-eaten old satirists, who plumb themselves on detecting the scientific ineptitude of religion, something which the blindest half see, but leave unexplored the habits of thought from which those tenets sprang. their original meaning and their true function. Here, after all, is a remarkable phenomenon, that men everywhere have had religions. How one can understand man if we do not understand religion? Such studies would bring the skeptic face to face with the mystery and pathos of mortal existence. They would make him understand why religion is so profoundly moving, and in a sense so profoundly just. Santayana thinks with Lucretius that it was fear which first made the gods. Faith in the supernatural is a desperate wager made by man at the lowest ebb of his fortunes. It is as far as possible from being the source of that normal vitality which subsequently, if his fortunes mend, he may gradually recover. If all went well, we should attribute divinity only to ourselves. The first things which a man learns to distinguish. Distinguish. Looked like a J. The first thing which a man learns to distinguish and repeat are things with a will of their own, things which resist his casual demands, and so the first sentiment with which he confronts reality in a certain animosity, which becomes cruelty toward the weak, and fear and fawning before the powerful. It is pathetic to observe how lowly are the motives that religion, even the highest attributes to the deity, and from what a hard-pressed and bitter existence they have been drawn, to be given the best morsel, to be remembered, to be praised, to be obeyed blindly and punctiliously. These have been thought points of honor with the gods, for which they would dispense favors, from which they would dispense favors and punishments on the most exorbitant scale. Add to fear imagination. Man is an incorrigible animist and interprets all things anthropomorphically. He personifies and dramatizes nature and fills it with a cloud of deities. The rainbow is taken for a trace left in the sky by the passage of some beautiful and elusive goddess. Not that people quite literally believe these splendid myths, but the poetry of them helps men to bear the prose of life. This mythopoetic tendency is weak today, and science has led to a violent and suspicious reaction against imagination. But in primitive peoples, and particularly in the Near East, it was unchecked. The Old Testament abounds in poetry and metaphor. The Jews who composed it did not take their own figures literally, but when European peoples, more literal and less imaginative, mistook these poems for science, our Occidental theology was born. Christianity was at first a combination of Greek theology with Jewish morality. It was an unstable combination, in which one or the other element would eventually yield. In Catholicism, the Greek and the pagan element triumphed. In Protestantism, the stern Hebrew moral code. The one had a Renaissance, the other a Reformation. The Germans, the northern barbarians, Santayana calls them, had never really accepted Roman Christianity, a non-Christian ethics of valor and honor, a non-Christian fund of superstition, legend, and sentiment subsisted always among medieval peoples. The Gothic cathedrals were barbaric, not Roman. The warlike temper of the Teutons raised its head above the peacefulness of the Oriental, and changed Christianity from a religion of brotherly love to a stern inculcation of business virtues, from a religion of poverty to a religion of prosperity and power. It was this youthful religion, profound, barbaric, poetical, that the Teutonic races insinuated into Christianity this substituted for that last sigh of two expiring worlds. Nothing would be so beautiful as Christianity, Santayana thinks, if it were not taken literally. But the Germans insisted on taking it literally. The dissolution of Christian orthodoxy in Germany was thereafter inevitable. For taken literally, nothing could be so absurd as some of the ancient dogmas, like the damnation of innocence, or the existence of evil in a world created by omnipotent benevolence. The principle of individual interpretation led naturally to a wild growth of sects among the people, and to a mild pantheism among the elite. Pantheism being nothing more than naturalism poetically expressed. Lessing and Goethe, Carlyle and Emerson were the landmarks of this change. In brief, the moral system of Jesus had destroyed that militaristic Yahweh, who by an impish accident of history had been transmitted to Christianity along with the pacifism of the prophets and the Christ. Santayana is by constitution and heredity incapable of sympathy with Protestantism. He prefers the color and incense of his youthful faith. He scolds the Protestants for abandoning the pretty legends of medievaldom, and above for all, for neglecting the Virgin Mary, whom he considers, as Henne did, the fairest flower of poesy. As a wit has put it, Santayana believes that there is no God, and that Mary is his mother. He adorns his room with pictures of the Virgin and the saints. He likes the beauty of Catholicism more than the truth of any other faith, for the same reason that he prefers art to industry. There are two stages in the criticism of myths. The first treats them angrily as superstitions. The second treats them smilingly as poetry. Religion is human experience, interpreted by human imagination. The idea that religion contains a literal, not a symbolic representation of truth and life is simply an impossible idea. Whoever entertains it has not come within the region of profitable philosophizing or that subject. Matters of religion should never be matters of controversy. We seek rather to honor the piety and understand the poetry embodied in these fables. The man of culture, then, will leave undisturbed the myths that so comfort and inspire the life of the people, and perhaps he will a little envy them their hope. But he will have no faith in another life. The fact of having been born is a bad augury for immortality. The fact of having been born is a bad augury for immortality. The only immortality that will interest him is that which Spinoza describes. He who lives in the ideal, says Santayana, and leaves it expressed in society or in art, enjoys a double immortality. The eternal has absorbed him while he lived, and when he is dead, his influence brings others to the same absorption, making them, through that ideal identity with the best in him, reincarnations are perennial seats of all in him which he could rationally hope to rescue from destruction. He can say, without any subterfuge or desire to delude himself, that he shall not wholly die, for he will have a better notion than the vulgar of what constitutes his being. By becoming the spectator and confessor of his own death and of universal mutation, he will have identified himself with what is spiritual in all spirits and masterful in all apprehension, and so, conceiving himself, he may truly feel and know that he is eternal. Did you catch that? Chapter 5. Reason in Society. The great problem of philosophy is to devise a means whereby men may be persuaded to virtue without the stimulus of supernatural hopes and fears. Theoretically, it solved this problem twice. Both in Socrates and in Spinoza, it gave the world a sufficiently perfect system of natural or rational ethics. If men could be molded to either philosophy, all would be well. But a truly rational morality or social regime has never existed in the world and is hardly to be looked for. It remains the luxury of philosophers. A philosopher has a haven in himself, of which I suspect that the fabled bliss to follow in others' lives is only a poetic symbol. He has pleasure in truth, and an equal readiness to enjoy the sense or quiet it. Though one may observe a certain obstinate longevity in them, for the rest of us, the avenue of moral development must lie in the future as in the past, in the growth of those social emotions which bloom in the generous atmosphere of love and home. It is true, as Schopenhauer argued, that love is a deception practiced upon the individual by the race, that 9/10 of the cause of love are in the lover, for 1/10 that may be in the object, and that love fuses the soul again into the impersonal blind flux. Nevertheless, love has its recompenses, and in his greatest sacrifice man finds his happiest fulfillment. Laplace is reported to have said, on his deathbed, that science was mere trifling, and that nothing was real but love. After all, romantic love, despite its poetical delusions, ends normally in a relationship of parent and child, far more satisfying to the instincts than any celibate security. Children are immortality, and we commit the blotted manuscript of our lives more willingly to the flames when we find the immortal text half engrossed in a fairer copy. The family is the avenue of human perpetuity, and therefore still the basic institution among men. It could carry on the race even if all other institutions failed, but it can conduct civilization only to a certain simple pitch. Further development demands a larger and more complex social organization, an intricate economic system in which the family ceases to be the productive unit, loses its control over the economic relations of its members, and finds its authority and its powers more and more appropriated by the state. The state may be a monster, as Nietzsche called it, a monster of unnecessary size, but its centralized tyranny has the virtue of abolishing the miscellaneous and innumerable petty tyrannies by which life was of old pestered and confined. One master pirate accepting tribute quietly is better than 100 pirates taking toll without warning and without stint. Hence, in part, the patriotism of the people. They know that the price they pay for government is cheaper than the cost of chaos. Santayana wonders whether such patriotism does more harm than good, for it tends to attach the stigma of disloyalty to advocates of change. To love one's country, unless that love is quite blind and lazy, must involve a distinction between the country's actual condition and its inherent ideal. And this distinction, in turn, involves a demand for changes and for effort. And we'll stop there.